I think it's about time for us to get started. For those of you who missed my halfway intro earlier, my name is Jake Ayres. I'm with Gupta, Evans & Associates. We are a boutique law firm that focuses on real estate litigation and bankruptcy, but my personal focus is helping cannabis and cannabis-adjacent companies, as well as hemp and CBD companies, comply with state, local, and federal regulations, as well as dealing with any disputes they may have with government agencies and business partners, vendors, or customers. So that is my role, and I wanted to convene this panel to talk about the industry-specific effects of COVID-19. Everyone's been talking about the effects of the COVID pandemic on just about everything, from real estate to school to the overall macro economy, and I wanted to narrow that aperture so that we can discuss the effects of COVID-19 specifically on the legal cannabis and legal hemp industries, particularly as it pertains to California. So that is who I am, and I wanted to take a moment and have our panelists go around. We've got a really great panel here today. Everybody here is very, very experienced, very knowledgeable about the legal cannabis industry. And I'm really excited to hear what everyone has to say about the industry at large and where it's going and where it is right now. So I'm going to go around the horn and have everyone introduce themselves. So I'll get started with the person that is displayed to my left, and that is Mark Rodriguez.
Hey, thanks, Jake. I really appreciate you putting this together. These are oftentimes a lot more work than you probably anticipate. So thanks again. Yeah, my company is Greenleaf Payroll and Business Solutions. We've been in servicing the cannabis industry specifically for about 5 years now. We have hundreds of clients in the cannabis industry that we do payroll HR services for. Our goal when we started the company was to provide a Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 feel for the employer-employee relationship, providing a timekeeping app solution, an applicant tracking solution, a full HRIS and timekeeping solution that integrates seamlessly with payroll, and then paying those employees electronically, just like they would get at a traditional business. And if for any operators on the phone, you may know that that's not always the easiest thing to do in the cannabis industry. So we help with all those things, along with some banking services as well.
All right, thank you, Mark. Shauna, could you go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody?
Yeah, I'm Shauna Blackburn from Cannabis Connect Insurance Services. It's nice to see everybody here today. I've been in the cannabis industry on both sides of the field as an operator and also as an insurance broker. I've got 25 years experience in high-risk commodity, and the last 5 or 6 years dedicated specifically to cannabis, working with one of the largest and the first nationwide cannabis insurance carrier in the United States. So this is the industry I love, and we protect and serve in the way of indemnification and finding places for you to put your coverages, and if the coverages are available, and creating new products. We have a really good group of allies. We're part of Aquasure, which is the United States' largest insurance agency in our country. So that's where I come from, and this is that's me. That's it.
All right, thank you very much, Shauna. Thank you for joining us. Let's go down to who is at the 6 o'clock position on my screen. That's Regina Unagovsky.
Hi there, guys. Regina Unagovsky. I'm a tax controversy attorney. Thank you so much for having me and putting this wonderful lunchtime Zoom together. My most typical cannabis client is having some kind of trouble with their taxes and maybe having less than pleasant interfaces with all of the acronyms that we love to hate. That's the IRS, the FTB, CDTFA, and more rarely, but sometimes the EPD. I think that the year ahead for cannabis is going to be exciting just because I have a number of investor clients who are looking to finally come off of the bench and stop waiting after COVID here relaxes a little bit and we see what the rest of the year looks like. Regina Unagovsky, thanks again for having me.
Thank you for being here, Regina. Last but not least, let's have Kim Sims introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. Thanks also for joining us. My name is Kimberly Sims, and I am an attorney, law office of Kimberly Sims, and I have actually been serving the cannabis industry since 2009. I am a corporate regulatory transactional attorney. So what that means is I do not go to court. I look to colleagues like Jacob and his team for things like that, but I work with clients through all cycles of the business life cycle. So I work with folks who are just starting out and interested in jumping into the marijuana or hemp world through licensing, contract drafting, leases, and then licensing as well at the state and local level. And thanks for having me. Kimberly Sims, Law Office of Kimberly Sims.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. So, and then before we get started, I saw we had a question in the chat that Mark was kind enough to answer. The question is whether this is going to be recorded, and the answer is yes. So we're going to record this webinar. It'll be available on our website, or if you prefer to reach out to one of us individually, we would be happy to forward you the recorded version of this webinar for your access at your leisure, and so that you can forward it to your referral partners and people in your circle. So just wanted to address that before we move on. So now that we have everyone introduced, we have to start with kind of the genesis of what I was thinking about when I wanted to put this together, and that is the fact that at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, certain businesses were deemed essential, and as we all are most likely familiar with, that included legal cannabis businesses. So the question is that means that they were allowed to operate in ways that other businesses were not during the pandemic. And the question is, what were the practical effects of this designation for the average operator in California? Now, that may be a little bit of a trick question because maybe there is no average operator in California. Everyone is, very diverse in this industry. I fully recognize that, but my question is to our panelists, and I'll toss this to Mark first, is that for your clients, the people that you service, what were the on-the-ground effects of being deemed essential right away? Was it a sense of relief or gratitude, or was it a sense of, oh my gosh, we're about to be completely slammed with business, or was it just confusion about what to expect?
Yeah, that's a good question. It all happened really fast for our clients, and I think that there was an overwhelming kind of sense of relief when the industry was deemed essential, and it was kind of going state by state. You saw Nevada made their choice, California made their choice, other states were making their choices, but I think overall very positive when it was deemed essential in California. Obviously, just like any other essential business, there was major staff concern, right, because of what was happening, the safety of the staff. So immediately, SOPs started getting drawn up. Some of our larger clients were really ahead of it, and they were testing, taking temperatures of their employees way before it was even even really thought about. They were putting that out to their clientele and their patrons, letting them know, like, hey, here are the steps we're taking. And they leaned on us for some of the HR practicality and legalities around some of those things. But then you had situations that would come up where employees were sick, and maybe they just had a cold, or maybe they had the flu, not a COVID related illness, and the employer was put in a spot where they had to now maybe possibly tell their other employees that the other employees were on the shift or at the place of the business at the time. So it put the operators in a really tough spot and put them in an HR sphere that I don't think they've ever had to be in before. Factor that into the emergency paid sick leave and the emergency family medical leave sick leaves. So if you don't know what those are really those allowed employers to take advantage of classifying any employee that went out with a COVID-related illness, or taking care of someone that was maybe a child that was forced to stay home from school. And it forced the employees to then classify that time that was taken as a certain pay type within their payroll system. So it really complicated things. I can go into that, but that is, it got a lot of operators thrown into the fire, and a lot of clients reaching out to us, prospects reaching out to us, asking us, hey, how do I do this? how do I make sure that my taxes, my pay types are being classified correctly so that I maximize my tax benefit?
Right.
Yeah, it's a loaded question, Jacob.
Right. I know. I'm sure you could go on and on, but I appreciate the brief summary. So, and that kind of covered some of the employment issues that I hope to discuss. And Kim, you and I talked about this a while ago. Could you maybe tell me a little bit about what the effect was on sales that for legal cannabis operators, at least from the outset of this the pandemic and being deemed essential?
Sure. And so I would love to just piggyback a little bit on what Mark was saying too. That was I found to be very interesting in the very early hours of cannabis being deemed as an essential business, was that it wasn't necessarily written or communicated in such a way that the entire supply chain was deemed essential. And so that caused a lot of confusion and panic. I represent cultivators, manufacturers, testing labs, distributors, and retailers. And so there was certainly, to Mark's point, a lot of relief and then follow-up concern about how retailers could continue to serve customers safely for the customers and the employees. And I know a lot of retailers made some immediate modifications in terms of temperature taking. Many began to do curbside pickup, which the Bureau of Cannabis Control later blessed. And so that was really helpful. But it definitely was complicated. And to your more immediate question is retail sales, there was definitely a spike in March without question, as people got concerned about supply, whether or not their favorite products would still be on the shelves if the rest of the supply chain wasn't deemed essential, and not knowing, because there was so much variation on a county by county level, I think people were also concerned. And then there was even a little bit of reversal that was happening that folks had to push against when cities would say, okay, A, B, C, D, and E is allowed. We would update our SOPs and affect our practices according to what the county said we were permitted to do, and then that would be rolled back. And so people were panicked for sure, and with a lot of time on their hands. And so there was an increase in sales. I think, again, anecdotally, what I've heard is that has leveled off now. And above and beyond that, I think that people are concerned, retailers are concerned about the long-lasting impacts of job loss and opportunity loss, and what that will do to their income and their ability to actually be able to afford cannabis. And that is a real concern.
Right.
For many people, it is a medicine. For many people, it is a luxury. For many people, it is both. But the reality is that a huge demographic of cannabis users are probably going to be those that are largely impacted by a loss of employment for the longer term. And so I think that there's absolutely concern about that. Add that on to the strain that the industry was under before all of this started, and I know we're going to talk about that in a few minutes as well. It's a challenging time, and also now people have stockpiles of cannabis for kind of like toilet paper, right? Like everyone's thinking, oh, the toilet paper manufacturers are doing amazing, but it's like, but when this all evens out, they're not going to be doing so great because we've all got like 2-year supply. So I think industry is feeling a little bit of trying to base their forecasts on that as well.
Right. And, I think we'll end up talking about this more in detail later, but is it fair to say that, and this, anyone can answer this, but is it fair to say that there's not as much elasticity in the pricing for dispensaries because of the tax burden? And it's not like, well, if our customers can't, afford to buy from us anymore, that they can slash their prices. Is it fair to say that because of is that because of the tax burden, or
I think that's a good question. I think from what I've seen, the companies that are vertically integrated have obviously the most leeway, but they also have the highest overhead. So I think you're seeing I see a lot more clients that are going into delivery and distribution to avoid kind of that whole sector entirely, and go direct to consumer on the delivery side. I think more and more are getting away from the retail. I think more and more are getting away from cultivation. It's going more to delivery and distribution methods.
Right. And Kim, you raised a good point. I'd like to maybe take this as an opportunity to expand further on it. You mentioned that even prior to COVID, the industry was experiencing a lot of challenges. So I just like to throw it open, and maybe we can go around the horn, and because since each of you have your own specialties, and talk about even prior to COVID, what were the biggest challenges that you were seeing your clients face operating in the legal cannabis industry? And we can just go ahead and start with you, Kim.
Sure, yeah. And I'd actually love to hear Regina's intake on the margins issue as well. But here's what I'll say. Listen, it's a great industry to be a part of. I would not want to be a part of any other industry, but it really feels like death, like 1,000 cuts and then maybe like a couple stabs in there. It is hard. It is a hard industry to be a part of. And as was mentioned, and again, certainly let Regina go into this in more detail, but we are taxed to the hilt at every level of the supply chain, at both the state and local level as well. And so it does make margins very challenging, and that is a huge issue. We need to see both tax simplification in the way it is collected, and we also need to see tax modification. And unfortunately, some of the bills that we had put forth at the beginning of this legislative session to accomplish that have, not surprisingly, been stalled. The cost of compliance is also incredibly challenging and burdensome. And so some of what can help that is, again, we have 3 lead agencies that we deal with. It's the Bureau of Cannabis Control, Cal Cannabis, which is in the Department of Ag, and then Department of Public Health, which deals with our manufacturers. And to put it bluntly, no pun intended, they each have their own set of regulations that sometimes dictate we do different things for the same scenario, and report certain things, and it's really burdensome. So we'd love to see some agency consolidation. And then I think it goes without saying that the burden that the unregulated market places on the regulated market is incredibly challenging. And so we need more local access, and the state has pretty much granted full authority for localities to decide the who, what, where, when, and how in terms of regulation of the commercial cannabis businesses. And that can range from a full ban to licensing anything in the way that they license. And so last I looked, we only have about a third-ish of localities that allow for some sort of commercial cannabis regulation, and that includes cities that might only allow for 1 dispensary or 1 testing lab. So you can ban regulated marijuana in your community, but you cannot ban it altogether. It is there. And so if we had more local access, that would create more opportunity for more license holders, and hopefully put a greater burden on cities to shut down the illicit market. So when you're thinking about all these taxes, and then this choice consumers have to go the old way with the street dealer at a half of the price, or the regulated market, it's challenging. And then there's a lack of education as well. I think a lot of consumers don't necessarily even realize there's a difference. And so we as an industry and the regulators need to do a better job at public education as well. So there's a lot of problems that we're dealing with. And again, unfortunately, due to COVID, a lot of those efforts that some of our leading trade organizations and lobbyists and larger companies were pushing towards are going to take the back seat. Understandably so, but we still are an industry that needs to survive. And of course, lack of access to banking and other typical business solutions is challenging.
Mm-hmm.
So
of course,
there's that to say a couple of things.
No, I appreciate it. I think that a lot of people, for the people in our audience that are not necessarily are interested but not necessarily plugged into the industry, it's valuable to hear these issues, because I think a lot of people think that that aren't familiar with the industry think that everyone in the cannabis industry is living the life of Riley and just raking in money. And while it's true in the aggregate that it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, the individual operator is not necessarily seeing a windfall because of all these challenges. So I appreciate you giving us a flyover of some of those issues. Regina, what's some of the biggest challenges prior to COVID that your clients were seeing from the legal cannabis industry?
Yeah, prior to COVID and post-COVID actually has little difference, in my opinion, and in my clients' experiences, I think, because they're coming to me as a result of attempting to be compliant with tax or running afoul of that compliance already. So either they're really trying hard to wade through the Byzantine nature of tax, and from my perspective, tax is always Byzantine, okay? It's always multi-layered, and it's always expensive, okay? A gallon of gas does not cost what we pay for it in California. It costs a very small fraction of what we actually pay. The rest are layers upon layers upon layers of tax, because it is something the state can make some money off of, okay? That's the same goes for every regulated item you can think of. I know that cannabis hates being likened to both tobacco and alcohol. So let's try something else. How about weapons? Okay, same concept, right? That article, that one item does not cost $600, okay? From a wholesale perspective. It doesn't. It costs $200, okay? Then throw in another $200 for all of the different layers of tax that somebody has to pay, as well as that retailer's markup. And now you have the final outcome you as a resident in the state of California are paying. The illicit market does 100% put so much pressure on everything, but on top of that, we have just a normalization of a per unit price, okay? Take any item that's out there regulated, okay, with a high level of taxability, and you and I have kind of a market understanding of what it should cost, okay? We know what one drink at the bar costs versus one bottle of alcohol, right, at Safeway or any other major retailer. And we know when things are very expensive, and we can look into why, okay? But when we have a cost differential of 1 to 3 between lawful and unlawful, and then a downward pressure on everybody's economic resources, okay? Now you start to look at a price per item that just might not be, frankly, worth it to a lot of consumers, especially because they may have never tried this product, who knows? So after all of that, I mean, the Byzantine nature of tax doesn't freak me out, right? It's there, it's valid, it's on everything, okay? But here's what's not present for everything. Penalties, upwards of 50 to 100% of tax not paid. And with agencies that the state of California can go ahead and fast forward right through your C Corp to individual liability. Talk about disincentivizing investment. Why on earth would any investor go ahead and plop down $5 million for your cannabis company, okay, and take the risk that down the road they might lose all their money? Sure, that's any investment, right? Risk of investment, but also be charged with personal liability on tax that you haven't paid as a cannabis operator. These types of high-level risks just typically aren't present elsewhere in the chain of commercial goods. I think that's a big problem. That's one that was present previously. That's one that's present currently. And that makes the growth of the lawful environment that much more challenged. You can't access capital through the banks. You can't access capital through traditional investors. And so now we're in this kind of dog eats dog environment where the investors are waiting for assets to become so distressed, right, that they can come in and buy them at rock bottom prices, because otherwise the risk profile is too high for them. Mm-hmm. I think that's a big challenge for a lot of my clients, both operators as well as the investors who are interested. You know, the risk profile just is a little bit high because it's well beyond just losing your money.
Hey, Regina, will you throw in just like a quick little couple sentences about 280E as well?
Oh, well, sure. I mean, I always presume everybody's familiar, if they're interested in cannabis, with 280E. 280E is our broad blanket IRS, IRC sections that prohibit the deduction of the vast majority of expenses associated with business if that business, let's put it quickly and shortly, in cannabis, okay? We can talk about other regulated or unlawful markets that are not relevant at this time and to this topic. The closer we are to production of cannabis, right, on one side of the spectrum, we've got cultivation all the way up to retail, if we call it like a rainbow of how much of your costs are eligible for deduction. On the cultivator side, you've got the most amount of deductions available. On the retail side, you have the fewest. And that's just the way that 280E works. Cost tracking is very popular. Carrybacks under the CARES Act are, I'm arguing it. I'm saying it's valid. So we shall see. I can tell you guys in about a month at my next appeals.
Right. Stay tuned, everybody. And then Shauna, if you could speak to some of the challenges on the insurance side that your clients were seeing prior to COVID that may have been exacerbated, but prior to is what.
Yeah, well, you know, COVID couldn't have come for a worse time, in my opinion, for the cannabis industry. Like Kim and Regina were saying, and Mark, you know, they're working at really thin margins as it is. The cultivators are, you know, I'm part of a growers alliance up here in the El Dorado County area. They're working at such thin margins. The pricing has been driven down. The black market still is in effect in, you know, full force. And what happened with COVID is, and, you know, the New York Times did an article about this. They couldn't get, I'm sorry, not New York Times, the Rolling Stone. They couldn't get access to the dispensaries and the products that they need. And, you know, it's not even just about, we want to get high. Like, this is medicine for a lot of people. If you met somebody who has fibromyalgia, if you met somebody who has Alzheimer's, if you met somebody who has arthritis, you know how essential,
right.
Excuse me, how essential these medicines are for them, or severe insomnia. They couldn't get access to it. So what they did was they went back to the black market where they can get access to things because, you know, they're not going to walk out of excuse me, they're not going to walk out of their door and have somebody cough on them, just like I did. And you know, it just, from my experience, what I've been seeing with my clients is they're fighting against the black market, and they're also fighting against the offices are closed. So BCC's closed, Department of Ag's closed, and they've got questions, or they've got, you know, pending license issues. I had one of my clients that didn't have something reported to the BCC correctly, and they couldn't get started. So I had to like go, you know, access some of my people that I know at the BCC to kind of help them get somebody to talk to, because the offices aren't open like they're used to.
And that's effectively punishing people that are trying to comply, right? You know, like,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and then last year also we had the vape crisis, right? So vape sales went down. It was just kind of like boom, boom, boom. We've gotten hit. We've gotten hit. So when you're factoring your accountants, you're factoring your attorneys, you're factoring your insurance costs, you're factoring your licensing, your human resources. These people don't have, you know, and the fact that, just like Regina said, you know, there's no way to get funding. You know, the investors, it's a joke. They're like, oh, sure, we'll invest. We're going to take 35 to 45%. And that's a real thing. And they want you to be partnered up with somebody else. I mean, there's just all these, it's ridiculous.
Right.
And California has typically been a state where, you know, we talk about being business friendly, but it's hard to do business in California. Let's face it. So that's kind of what I've been seeing. That's the feedback I've been hearing. I'm sure a lot of people that are listening to this can probably relate, because they're going, oh, we went through that too. But that's what I've been seeing. And of course, having to change their model due to COVID.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And for, the people that the friendliness to business of California is something that I'm sure would resonate with one Elon Musk, who was complaining loudly and vociferously about that. So Mark, how about your clients? What were the biggest challenges they were seeing prior to COVID?
I think it was mainly the tax environment. I feel like that along with just navigating basic fundamental HR, right? When it comes to developing an infrastructure, a lot of companies were experiencing tremendous growth over the last couple of years. And those companies were just struggling putting together compensation plans for managers, for salespeople, putting together policy around social media and the workplace. Drug and alcohol policies was a big one. Do we test our employees? Do we not test our employees? Questions on that. But I think those things are always have always been a challenge. Will continue to be a challenge for the cannabis industry, especially because it's so underserved, right? The big players that are payroll and HR outsourcing companies don't work with the cannabis industry. So these cannabis companies are kind of left with figuring it out on their own, which inevitably is expensive because they do it wrong most of the time. Spending the money to hire someone internally that knows what they're doing, but they still need a resource like us to handle payroll, to handle some of the HR components. And then, ultimately, if they do get in with a big company that's kind of under the radar, and they cannot be transparent with those companies and tell them what they're doing. And then banking, obviously an issue, having enough money in their bank account to make payroll through ACH. In those situations, losing your bank account, losing their payroll provider at the same time, because that payroll provider won't work with them now because they've lost the bank account and that company cannot pull their payroll taxes. So it was a snowball of those kinds of things. Pre-COVID, post-COVID, not a whole lot different. Not a whole lot different.
Right. Well, thanks everybody for going around the horn and talking about that topic of what was, and it sounds like for the most part, the challenges that they're experiencing during COVID were existing prior to it. It's just that COVID came at a time where it exacerbated a lot of those problems and has kind of laid bare some of the problems that are inherent to the industry, namely the overburdening of taxation. That's the common thread here, the pressures of the black and gray market, and just the lack of education that comes with that as well. So we'll continue to talk about that as we go through. But moving back to the topic of the effects of being designated as essential, Kim and Regina, and you can go in whatever order you'd like to, once businesses are deemed essential, did that trigger any legal requirements, or were there any things that needed to be done right after that happened, or any letters that needed to go out to employees or shareholders, or were there any things that were triggered immediately as a result of that designation for your clients?
The main thing that do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay. The main thing that comes to mind with that question was this move towards permission for curbside pickup. So not, many localities don't, well, that's generally not allowed unless you're talking about like a delivery retailer that comes to your door. And that's also
Kim,
not
Kim,
curbside.
before we go any further, I just realized I kind of want to establish something for the audience.
Oh, sure.
As far as the legality of delivery and curbside pickup, that is something that's totally subject to local control, correct? In terms of counties, municipalities, that is not controlled by the BCC.
Correct, except that what started to happen was that retailers were being granted permission by the Bureau of Cannabis Control to move to a curbside pickup so long as they could create camera access to that location. And they continued to meet all of the other requirements. And then some of the cities, like San Diego, for example, were a little bit behind in terms of approving that as well. So those types of things have come up, some of these changes in operating procedures, or to the extent that you might change the physical layout of your premises to accommodate for social distancing. And again, it depends on the extent, the changes that you're making. That is a notification that you may need to make to the Bureau of Cannabis Control. And then we have recently, within the last few days, actually received notice from the 3 agencies that you can request for a deferment of your renewal fees, your licensing renewal fees. So it's also at a really interesting time in the industry where a lot of the initial folks that applied at the state level for their licenses are coming up for renewal. So it's like our first batch of renewals that we're dealing with, and So we're working through that and some of the requests for fee deferrals. I have just been, and my practice does not include employment law. So, I lean pretty heavily on folks like Mark and my colleagues that do practice employment law for what types of policies that need to be updated in terms of sick leave or notice requirements. And maybe Shauna can speak to this, but I believe there's a couple of shifts that occurred with some of the laws surrounding workers' compensation as well. But really, for my clients, it's just been attempts at business as usual and still trying to push through, to your point, some of these other problems that we were having prior to COVID. And another thing that actually, this doesn't really fit squarely into the question that you asked, but it's in my mind and pertinent, I think, to all these other things that we've been talking about, is remembering that because of our lack of access to banking, a lot of transactions are made in cash. And that is an even increased public safety concern in the world of COVID. So just again, business is trying to make sure that they have the proper protective gear for the employees, and me continuing to be able to operate in a way that is safe for customers and their employees.
Right. So I want to go to Regina and ask if there were any, immediate legal consequences or obligations that were triggered by COVID. And then I want to move around to Shauna to talk about the workers' comp issue that Kim just mentioned.
Yeah, in my world, there was no immediate consequence or, filing requirement or compliance or anything else. In fact, all compliance got pushed back. There were automatic extensions on everything that you can imagine. I think that the most important thing that I have seen as a result of being deemed an essential business is an attitude problem. So I've got my collection personnel, right, from all different types of taxing agencies saying, what's your problem? Why can't you just pay off this tax? You're an essential business. You must be raking it in right now.
Right, yeah.
House is closed. And so, my favorite thing to ask is, well, you guys are open. Did you get a raise last month? So it's just it's a perception. It's an optics issue.
Right. I mean, and that's what we keep coming back to, is that I think there's a misconception about the industry in terms of how much money it's making. And it's ironic that it's coming from the people that should have visibility to the exact amount of money that everyone's making. It's the people that have visibility to these financials, and they should be looking at these tax filings and saying, oh, these guys are actually not making a ton of money, but now they're acting like, oh, you're raking it in during you're still paying the same tax obligations. So it's kind of surprising, but that's again probably a lack of education internally.
And hazard pay. I mean, there are increased expenses now, right? The volume you can do has possibly gone down based on how many employees you are still operating with, or without rather. Many companies thankfully have instituted hazard pay as they should. I mean, a lot of cannabis companies, we're good actors. We want to do right by our employees. So I would actually argue the cost of operations have gone up.
Yeah,
right.
Agreed. And you factor in the competitive market, the competitive landscape of cannabis just in general. We're not even talking about that there's new brands. There's brands now that are going after the consumer that doesn't have as much money, right? There's brands that are trying to fill in every segment in the market, and that's taking market share away from the companies that were doing well. And those companies are shrinking, downsizing. So it's it's wild game right now.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So I just wanted to loop back around to Shauna to discuss the workers' compensation issue that Kim raised. So could you speak to the workers' compensation guidance that came out of the state of California and how it's affecting cannabis businesses, as well as every other business under the sun as well?
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's not just going to be affecting our states. It's going to affect most states in the United States. What's happening is the individual governors are going through their workers' compensation policies that they have set, with the legislation and forcing workers comp carriers to pay for claims that they didn't originally agree to. And the reason being, the justification behind this is because if you're an essential worker and you have to be on the premises, there's really no way to tell if you get COVID where you got it from. Did you get it from work? Did you get it from the grocery store? Da, 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 da. So our governor in California, Newsom, stepped in and said, hey, sorry, workers' comp, you guys are going to pay these claims, after you've gone through, like what Mark was talking about before, the disability and family leaves and all that stuff, workers' comp, and you have a very limited time as a carrier, as a broker, to get those claims going. I mean, the Department of Insurance is really on it. They're like, hey, you got 30 days. That means the claim has to be going, and investigation has to be active, and all the facts have to be in, and there has to be some sort of resolution or work towards settlement. So the push is there on that, and unfortunately, that's going to drive up the workers' comp prices. Now, workers' comp is not how many employees you have. That's not how you rate it. It's rated on payroll. So if, like how Kimberly said, you have hazard pay, so now your payroll has gone up, your workers' comp has gone up, and the market's going to get what's called a hard market. That means that the prices of workers' comp is going to go up, the rates. So their operating costs are going to go up even more. The good news is that workers' comp has been kind of a soft market for a long time. It's kind of been on the low side, but it's going to jump up there. There's other issues too, just besides workers' comp. There's auto, because if you have a business that was a dispensary and now you're having to do outside delivery pickups and all this kind of stuff, that changes everything. And there's still not a whole lot of product offerings out there. There's something like less than, I want to say it used to be less than 18, and I'm thinking it's probably less than 15 carriers that will even touch this industry in the first place. And even less for CBD, believe it or not, even though they're federally legal. There's so many, and I know you guys as probably, legal professionals, I see the claims come in all the time from Law 360 about labeling issues. The federal government doesn't want to push some of these because the FDA didn't make clear guidelines, and so everybody's on a freeze for their litigation, and there's a lot of weird stuff. But in the meantime, guess what? The insurance carriers are paying for defense. It's built into their policy forms. And so my concern is pricing getting, we're really going to have to shop for them, because pricing is just going to get tougher and tougher for, like I said, these operators that are working on pretty slim margins right now.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, it sounds like it's and do you anticipate that there might be, is that subject to challenge? Like, have there been rumblings from people, from your clients, that are thinking about maybe mounting a lobbying based or a legal based challenge to these new rules that are coming out, and trying to narrow the scope because of the overbreadth of that, like you said, how would you know this presumption that's taking effect, that if you get COVID, that it's coming from the workplace? Or is this something that's kind of beyond, that's too difficult to undo now that it's been done?
Oh no, the business owners are ticked, and they should
Okay.
be. They should be, because they're paying the hazard pay, their premiums are going to go up, and people are going to claim they got COVID from this or that place or whatever, and their carriers didn't originally agree to pay for viruses and bacterial infections and communicable diseases, and now they're being forced to. So they didn't rate for it, now they're being forced to pay, which, for them, okay, well, that's good, but there's going to be a lot of people taking advantage of that, right? Just like a lot of people right now are taking advantage, and I'm sure, Regina, you've probably seen this a ton, where people are taking advantage of the fact that their unemployment is more than actually going to work. That's another big challenge my operators are having. They're like, I can't get delivery drivers because they're getting paid $900 a week or $600 a week or whatever. And, I think it's just, it's really important to stay close with our clients right now and really help them through and guide them through this. But the information that I've been getting back, the stuff I've been seeing on the media, is they're raising their hands and they're going, we don't agree with this,
Yeah.
But Newsom's in a spot because, it's like, you got to protect the businesses, you got to protect the public, and, not everything can come from the state. So it's a tough one. For
Yep.
sure.
Absolutely. Just my litigator brain wheels are turning a little bit, and I'm sure there are people thinking about takings and also about contracts clause claims, like where the government is effectively rewriting the policy.
Yep.
And isn't the policy a form of a contract? And doesn't the contracts clause say that the government can't interfere with private contracts? So
That's
I'm
correct.
sure there are some constitutional lawyers getting some angry phone calls from industry people. So we'll see what happens. I'm sure that will be litigated in the near future.
I'm hearing a lot about that. Sorry, Kim. I'm hearing a lot about that. And I predicted it when this first happened. I went, oh boy, there's going to be a lot of attorneys that are working for these carriers that are going to jump all over that. And they should. The contract is in writing, it's binding, you know, and the state shouldn't be allowed to change it. And it is going to affect our business owners negative. It will hurt them. So they should, you know.
I'm just thinking about like litigation fallout from COVID in general, and not even just marijuana industry, but I'm thinking like of all these different force majeure clauses in contracts and impossibility and impracticability, and you know, the country is going to be feeling the effects of this for a very long time to come. You know, even when we are allowed to all come out and hang again. You know, this is a marked time in history that will be talked about in classrooms and from an academic perspective and an economic perspective and a legal perspective for many, many, many moons to come. So it's really interesting to hear. Like, I'm even learning so much on this webinar too. So thanks, Jacob.
No problem.
Yeah, just.
Yeah, shameless plug as well. My colleague Chris Evans has a great article on force majeure clauses and impossibility and statutory impossibility on our website. So if you're interested in any of those issues, feel free to check that out. But you're absolutely right. It doesn't just stop with those. It's going to be litigated heavily in the next couple months, but a lot of it depends on the exact verbiage in the contract. That's like your first line of defense, is how broad is that force majeure clause? But that is a topic for another day. You could have a whole
Right. Well,
webinar.
I mean, I know that I'm certainly going back, you know, and looking at a lot of contracts, and, you know, to the extent that the parties will not agree to mutually amend, it's definitely dictating how I'm drafting now, for sure.
Right.
With
So
are
you explicitly incorporating pandemic government action? It's related or government shutdowns? Like,
it depends.
Uh-huh.
It depends. What I'm kind of thinking of right now is where I've been putting it in most frequently is in like contingencies during due diligence periods that for vetting different deals that particularly on behalf of a buyer, that impacts of COVID-19 or pandemics, you know, on buyers' financial ability to bring deal to fruition, things like that. Because it can, I just feel like this is, I just feel like every day we're reading and learning something new about COVID and how it's going to impact. So I'm trying to make the language as broad as I can. But everything's always up for negotiation, friendly negotiation. So, it's definitely impacting the way I'm thinking about different contracts. It's again come up most for me at present in and how I'm thinking about due diligence and the inability to move forward with a particular deal, and that being just cause and things like that.
Of course. Well, and one of the other things that this is tangentially related to that I did want to cover, you know, and we're in broad strokes, is that you know, a lot of what people in the industry have been talking about is the tension between being designated as essential, but also being shut off from federal aid programs like PPP and those loan programs that are designated for small businesses. And if the typical cannabis business weren't dealing in cannabis, they would qualify for those things, presumably. I mean, on the basis of the fact that a lot of them do fit that small business designation. So I guess the question is what aid is available to, first of all, I guess the first question is there a limit to that? Are cannabis adjacent companies getting shut out of PPP loans and federal aid programs? Is there any workaround to get into that pot of federal money to the extent that it's not already exhausted? And it pretty much is at this point. And then secondly, the question is, what state level aid programs are available, if any, for cannabis businesses? Because they're shouldering a lot of the risk and continuing to operate and being deemed essential, but there's really no safety net for them that there is for other small businesses. So I'm just going to throw this open to the crowd because I know you all probably have thought about and dealt with these things. So
Jacob, good question. I want to get some insight from Regina too on this, but I will tell you from our perspective on the payroll reporting side that we're responsible for pulling all those reports for our clients, giving them access to online. Having hundreds of clients in the cannabis industry, I will tell you that there are several that I'm aware of that receive PPP loans. Whether that's legal or illegal, there's several that I know that receive them. Now, some of your more advanced operators have multiple IDs with companies that are not plant touching,
right,
that do a lot of the administrative work that receive PPP loans as well. There are things like payroll tax deferral options for some of these cannabis companies, which on the IRS website, it says available to all employers. Doesn't have any designation of cannabis or non, and cannabis companies can take advantage of that right away. And that lets them defer their payroll tax, a portion of the payroll tax for the remainder of 2020, and then pay that back over a 2-year time frame. But that's kind of what I've seen in terms of access to any government-related subsidies or anything like that. That's really the extent of it. There's the PPP loans, obviously some of the EIDL stuff for the non-plant touching companies. I've seen them have success there. And then overall, the EFMLA and the EPSL, clarifying those as proper sick pay type for the people that were not attending work is really important as well, because that comes directly off their payroll tax liability per payroll every week or every other week. So doing those things is really important because that's really all the cannabis industry has that I've seen. And I would defer to Regina on the rest there.
I'm glad that I'm supposed to know the rest. Here I am. I can tell you that cannabis adjacent companies, even as close as professional service providers. Okay, so a number of my colleagues who are attorneys and CPAs were afraid to file or to request PPP assistance or EIDL assistance because the spirit and the word of the law states that we're not eligible. Okay, and so we shouldn't be receiving those. Now, with that said, yes, many did receive those benefits and that assistance, whether or not they're audited later, be it by a bank or by the SBA, and are deemed to have fraudulently, taken advantage of those systems is a different issue. That's an enforcement question, and I really don't know how they're going to manage that. I'm going to be honest with you. Okay. So the SBA doesn't have enough people to even process the loans that they have right now. How on earth are they going to investigate them all later? I am not a big believer in bureaucratic efficiencies, so I have no idea how that will happen, down the road. Otherwise, those extensions are kind of the breadth and the width of the benefits, let's put it that way, or the relief packages that were made available and are available for cannabis or not cannabis in the state of California. You have to take a look at your local jurisdiction to figure out if your city or county offered anything in particular. Here in the Bay Area, I didn't see a whole heck of a lot. I mean, not even in terms of deferring extensions or granting extensions for filing periods. So, the big stuff on payroll sides and, extensions like that, those are, to me, none of that is that's just kicking the can down the road. That's not actual relief. That doesn't put money in your pocket. That doesn't pay a bill. Okay. It just
like a bridge loan, right?
Yep.
I mean, it's not even that though, because it just
less than.
Here it is. It was due on April 15th. Now it's due on July 15th. Okay. And when clients come to me and they say, wow, should I take it? Should I take it? I sit there and I'm just kind of like, so payroll mushrooms has 100% penalties before we even talk about the cannabis issue. That's just in general. Okay. And you do not have to pass go. You do not collect $200 on the monopoly board. You get assessed personally immediately. So if all of the tax that's out there that can have negative implications generally, and outside of it being cannabis, it's definitely payroll. So I wasn't big on advising it.
Yep. I would go back to a couple things, Jacob, and thanks, Rena. On the PPP loans, the SBA has said that under $2 million is kind of good faith. Hey, under $2 million, if you received under $2 million, we're just kind of going to go, okay, it's good, right? Everyone that's received over $2 million, we're going to take a closer look at. That's directly from them. If in the EIDL loan, the maximum you could receive on the EIDL loan was that $10,000 advance, or if you have, it's $1,000 per employee essentially. So if you have 10 employees or more, you were going to get $10,000 in EIDL advance plus another $150,000. Now, there's specific things you can and cannot use that money for, you know, there's no way the government can, and from what I've seen, there's no way the government's going to be able to monitor and track these things. The only record they have is a 941, the payroll reporting, tax reporting data, and that's it.
Right.
I got a couple thoughts. Well, one thing I just want to reference the hi puppy, the panelists too, is that in August of 2019, the SBA put out a marijuana policy that very clearly says and spells out what indirect marijuana businesses are. So to the extent that you want to contact me directly or via Jake, I'm happy to send you that memo. You know, I am very risk averse, which is kind of ironic given the industry I've chosen to serve. But I think that is why a lot of my clients appreciate working with me, besides my sense of humor and intelligence. But I agree that enforcement, especially for some of these smaller amounts, is kind of like a not very likely. However, here's what I will say. The DOJ is absolutely ramping up their enforcement staff, and they have said that publicly. I just always feel like marijuana businesses are such low-hanging fruit, and we are really fun and easy to target. So while, sure, it may not be widespread enforcement, I have a great concern that we will still be made an example of, because the federal government loves nothing more than to paint the industry as the big, bad, boogeyman. And so I have very strongly advised clients. I mean, the ones that are directly touching the plant, that's kind of like a no-brainer, but I represent a number of brands that do not directly manufacture or distribute their product. And I represent a number of testing labs as well that is considered indirect. And I have really just said I would err on the side of caution here. And if there's any possible way for you to stay afloat by not taking the money, don't take it. Also, the other thing to bear in mind is that normally the banks do have some responsibility to do some diligence on the loans that they're providing. But under the CARES Act, they basically were given more or less like carte blanche to just issue, and don't worry about it, get the money to the people. And so it's tough, but again, I would advise not to, because I would just hate to see one of our own to be made the example of, and God only knows then what kind of like backward progress and how the media will spin that. So we're in a tough spot, to be sure. And to Regina's point, really the deferment is the only thing that I've seen. Even some of the California programs are backed by federal institutional money, so we're not eligible for those. So it's a tough position, to be sure. And much like all of the cannabis industry, you really have to sit and do a risk assessment with each and every client based on their circumstances. There's no advice. There's not really blanket advice here. But mine has, again, been much more of the concerned, pessimistic, risk-adverse counsel.
I think
that's just my style.
Yeah, no, I think it speaks to the companies that set their organizations up properly with multiple IDs to streamline their accounting practice.
But I don't agree with that. Because then I think like a management company or potentially an IP holding company is still considered an indirect. If they're receiving revenue from the licensed company, which is the only place you can ultimately receive it from, because that's the profit center, then I would argue they potentially potentially are still one and the same, especially too if you have all commonality in ownership as well. So that is a strategy we employ in general to try and maximize profit and lawfully handle our banking and 280E issues. Again, lawfully handle them, but I don't think it in any way gets you around the SBA loan issue.
No, I think that's a good point. In regards to, there's ways to set up companies like staffing companies. I'm not talking about in terms of a staffing company and companies paying employees of other companies, which is complete violation of 280. But the companies, the employees that aren't plant touching a sister company, similar ownership, not common ownership, not the same ownership. I think that speaks to your point about individual consultation on each entity. And I think that's so important because not every company is the same. It's not a traditional business. It's completely different.
Yeah, it's tough. It's a super fun industry to serve, but it's not without its challenges, and each day is different.
That's why we do this, right?
I wanted to speak to what Kim and Mark was talking about only because I have quite a bit of experience in the realm of setting up management companies in order to operate with some kind of sustainability. So what I have been seeing, and a vast majority of our clients and clients that I was getting when I was working from the carrier side had these management companies, and they would figure it out. It'd be less than, I want to say it was like 38% of ownership, just to kind of wiggle around these laws so that they could do things like lease employees back to themselves, lease buildings back to themselves, collect on, and Regina could probably tell you probably a lot more about this than I can, get some kind of tax relief for property and assets that they own that go towards the business, and all these employment tax issues, and being able to get a bank account. Because even though there's options right now for people who are, plant touching and everything, and everything, oh, SafeAct's not that important. I disagree, because I'm also on the, collecting side as far as insurance premium, but I'm also on the operator side. And it's still, if you, bounce too many checks or anything, it's nothing like the normal banking system. They'll kick you out quick. So you have to work within their rules, and their rules are really tight. They're not unreasonable, but they're super tight. And that being said, I just think that it's more of the model that I've been seeing, especially businesses that have vertical models, that I've been seeing that they'll branch out a little LLC that's a management company.
All right. Well, I wanted to shift briefly because I know we're kind of running out of time here, and I wanted to talk what the future looks like. We've been talking about present challenges, and we've alluded to what the future looks like, but I kind of wanted to put a more direct question to all of you. The first thing I want to do is my little spiel about bankruptcy and its unavailability, or generally speaking, unavailability to plant touching or companies that derive their revenue from cannabis. And there's a case that I've been monitoring very closely in the District of Colorado called United Cannabis, and where they very cheekily filed bankruptcy on 4/20 and were trying to get relief from the court because there was a prior court decision in the District of Colorado that said that if you can do your Chapter 11 plan of reorganization for bankruptcy and do the reorganization without deriving money from, without using money that's derived from the sale of legal cannabis, then even if you are in part deriving money from that or gaining revenue from it, you could still declare bankruptcy. The way the opinion was worded left that open. That's the Way to Grow case, where a hydroponics company that overwhelmingly sold its equipment to cannabis businesses was denied its petition for bankruptcy because the majority of its money came from them. So United Cannabis is claiming that because only a small portion of their money comes from cannabis, that they're able to still claim bankruptcy under declare bankruptcy under Chapter 11. That has still been undecided, and I'm watching it like a hawk. But given that bankruptcy is unavailable for distressed, or largely as of yet unavailable for distressed cannabis businesses, What else is out there for cannabis businesses that have been hit hard by this pandemic, whether that's just out and out dissolution, sale to a larger conglomerate, or approaching investors? What are the business solutions for companies that have become distressed to bounce back from this, or to shut their doors in an orderly fashion? And to what extent are you hearing that from your clients? Have they become so distressed that they're considering these alternative solutions?
Come see me at my office. JK, but not really. Figure out, first and foremost, or your office, Jake, figure out first and more importantly than anything else, your order of creditors, right? So that you can who's priority, non-priority, and move forward with ordering those so that you are expending whatever resources you do have left in as beneficial a manner as possible for your shareholders, your directors, your officers, all of that kind of good stuff. At that point, it's too late to reorganize, right? I mean, I can't help you if you had a disregarded LLC for 3 years at this point. It's not going to be as easy as just a straight dissolution or something like that. Tax, there is methodology. There are settlement paths. They're not straightforward. They're not easy. They're not going to be just, kind of handed out as a result of COVID. What we're typically trying to do is to shelter the people, behind the business from any kind of liability that might hit them. And of course, there's receiverships. I am already seeing it. I was seeing it before COVID. I expect to see it in greater numbers after COVID. And I think that our friends to the north in Canada are listing a pretty high rate of bankruptcy interest at this point as well. So I think we'll see how that kind of, all trickles down and what happens in the long run. But we'll have to figure something out, right?
Yeah, I think so. And then more broadly, beyond it, to the extent that, the cannabis businesses are able to survive, what does the industry look like after COVID? Does it move more does curbside delivery stick around, or curbside pickup stick around? Does delivery end up predominating? Do we end up having delivery only with no brick and mortar dispensaries in order to limit the spread of germs and personal contact? What does the industry look like, broadly speaking, after this?
I think if you look at California as a whole, in a desperate tax situation, potentially entering a recession, I could see the industry experiencing some form of deregulation. And, thinking down the line, we could see flower in convenience stores, right? Pre-rolls in convenience stores to generate more tax revenue. I think eventually the retail model goes away. I think that you're going to see that downside. You're going to see a lot of deregulation around what that looks like and the security measures. I think ultimately it is a business, or it's a business to consumer delivery to your doorstep kind of product. I think that's where you look at companies like Amazon, case in point. We have several large distribution companies that are well over 100 employees that are doing just that, and they're hiring 5 or 10 people a week. Mm-hmm. So it seems to be a demand for that.
Right. Yeah.
I would agree with that. I've been seeing a huge influx of people contacting our agency asking for commercial auto coverage for their delivery drivers. And they have the same kind of business model. A lot of them have the same kind of business model as Ease or as Uber, like Uber Eats or whatever, where they're paying delivery drivers, separately, and they're trying to figure out everybody's trying to navigate their way around the employment laws. This is a sub, and that kind of thing. And it's a little bit of a mess. But that was the biggest thing I've seen in COVID is that not everybody, like a good majority of the retailers went over to the delivery services, and people, up here where I'm at, that everything stayed open. Even walk-in stayed open. Curbside happened, but walk-in stayed open. And then everybody did a max of 6 to 10 people in the showroom, depending on the size of the showroom. So, but it's kind of ironic to me that we would choose now to implement these kind of things, because the marijuana industry has been self-protected the whole entire time, at least the whole entire time I've been in it. Before there was insurance, before there were accountants, before there were attorneys or human resources people, we were winging it. So even when it became medicinally legal, there was hardly any services. So, you know, I think it's important for them to remember that what we learned back in the golden ages: stay close away from people, keep our implements clean, keep our screens up, keep our sanitation, our sanitized workstations clean, using our hand sanitizer. That's just par for the course if you're in the operating space. And a lot of the old timers that are watching this, they know that. Like, we only had alcohol to clean the sticky stuff off our stuff, you know? So it just is going back to the basics. Be careful, stay clean, look for if something can happen, it will, and then protect yourself likewise.
Right. Absolutely. So with our last couple minutes here, I was kind of intending this to go about an hour 15. So with our last couple minutes, I wanted to answer the two pending questions that we have. We had Aya asked a question very early on, and she's still in here. So I wanted to give her the answer to her question. So her question from the chat is that, is there data to show that the states have deemed cannabis essential have been able to stay afloat economically compared to states that have shut down cannabis? I mean, I'll throw that open to you guys, but my gut reaction is that I think it's too early to tell. And then maybe that also segues into the conversation we were having ahead of this, in that talking about tax revenue being generated from cannabis, and that it's maybe less than people anticipated, but for reasons that are beyond its control. And I know Regina came prepared with some data on that. So again, this is not up to date because we're dealing with tax data from 2018 and 2019. So it's hard to say what it's going to look like for Q1 and Q2 of 2020 until a year later. But with that caveat, Regina, take it away.
Yeah, so our tax revenue data for 2018 to 2019 in the state of California overall, we have tax revenue at approximately $137 billion. 19 to 20 was projected at $143 billion. So over the course of 2 years, you can see there's an average of approximately $140 billion in tax revenue that the state of California generates from all sources. Our personal income tax is the state's #1 revenue resource. Now, property tax is the #1 local tax revenue driver, and both the state and localities draw from sales and use tax, okay? On the side of what we've been able to collect from cannabis, from lawful cannabis, the CDTFA has reported a total of $1.03 billion over the course of 2 years. That's 2018 and 19. That is tax reported, not collected. Collection rates are at less than 50% currently. So overall, cannabis represents, I believe, approximately 0.35% of the state of California's tax revenue, and then we have to have that for actual collection. In the agriculture world, actually cannabis is surpassed by milk, grapes, and cotton. Here to help. I'm here to help you guys.
Well, yeah.
See if we can chase down milk.
Yeah. Well, we are a very big wine producing state, so I'm not surprised that grapes are high up there in terms of generating revenue.
I've lived in California my whole life. I had no idea we were a cotton producing place.
I only know that because I play a lot of bar trivia, and that came up one time. So.
I'm ready to play you, Jake. Let's go.
Yeah, no, I'm anytime. Once this thing opens back up, that's I'd kill to play beer league trivia. And then so thank you for that, Regina. I appreciate that answer. I got just posted in the chat her gratitude for that. And then I want to segue to Tom's question. Hopefully he's still in here, but if not, I think it's a worthwhile question. He was asking if CBD, since CBD businesses are able to get the PPP, do you see them applying for the Main Street lending program as well? And I think that's an individual decision, but my gut reaction is that the federal government has been the one pushing hemp down the line, and they're the ones that are sending letters to banks urging them to lend to hemp businesses, because the banks are too conservative, because they, somewhat justifiably are concerned about, hemp going hot and going over that 0.3 THC % threshold. So banks are like, well, unless you can guarantee that there's a way for these plants to not magically transform overnight into marijuana, which they might, which is Schedule 1, then we don't feel comfortable lending. And the federal government is saying, no, you guys are all clear, please do this. So there's been a bunch of federal momentum, and without casting conspiratorial aspersions, I think it's in large part due to the fact that hemp grows very well in Kentucky, which is the home state of a certain Senate majority leader. But he's been very aggressive in pushing that agenda. So my gut reaction to this is that politically and legally speaking, I think that, whether PPP or Main Street Lending Program, I don't think there would be any real roadblocks to a hemp company that is above board and has the appropriate, Department of Agricultural license from applying to get that sort of loan. But like Kim said earlier, I think if you can survive this crisis without it, then, maybe don't hold, but maybe that's advice that applies more to cannabis businesses that aren't subject to the same scrutiny, or that are subject to more scrutiny than hemp businesses. So that's my gut reaction. But Kim, you can speak to that.
I agree. I agree with your assessment overall, and a lot. This is the first time in this particular webinar that we're drawing a distinction, I think, between marijuana and hemp.
Right. I should have prefaced that.
Which
I just jumped right in, but
no, it's great. Which hemp, we can do another webinar on all things hemp for sure. But it is challenging for banks and other service providers in the hemp realm, because what has been regulated or descheduled is hemp and all of its derivatives, which most people tuning in today would think of would be CBD. That's the popular one. But what has not really been fully regulated from like a testing perspective and a state by state perspective is CBD in ingestible products. And so and that would mean your foods, your tinctures, pet foods, things like that. And the FDA has basically said, like, we're working on it, we're trying to figure it out, and their enforcement has largely been geared towards improper health claims, because the FDA is concerned obviously with protecting public health and safety. But what I find when I do have the opportunity to interface with the banks, which I don't a lot, but sometimes, is that they just don't really understand what we're talking about, what we're dealing with, and what the differences are. And they don't want the headache of diligence on it. And the fact that, at least in California, while we do regulate hemp farmers, we don't, like other states, have a producer's license or, anything that's really regulating our consumer goods. And so when you think about the overall hemp market, yes, you have your farmers, but the types of people that I'm dealing with on a more regular daily basis are those that are seeking to make some sort of consumer good from the hemp derivatives. And that is not really largely regulated. And I think the banks really don't even understand a lot of them don't really even understand what questions to ask. So that's where some of the challenges come up with banking and the hemp industry. It's, again, another set of fun challenges that we deal with. But as far as applying for the programs, go for it. Especially if you're confident that your sources are legal and lawful, and they come with certificates of analysis showing that the hemp is below the 0.3% THC, which for the listeners that don't know, that's the legal distinction. Cannabis is cannabis is cannabis, the botanical term, really. Hemp and marijuana are legal terms, and the legal significance is within how much THC there is, and 0.3 is the threshold. So,
like you, Kim.
Maybe I should have led with that.
Good info. Like you, Kim, we have being a cannabis payroll and HR services company. All the consultants that we work with, everyone that we work with on the marijuana and the hemp side, everyone has told me that the hemp industry is riddled with fraud right now, with a lot of companies coming into the hemp industry under the guise of hemp, right? Really to produce marijuana. And you just saw, if you guys were watching the news the other night, there was that big bust outside of Blythe, 40-acre farm that was taken down. That was a commercial hemp farm that was not, right? Things like that. The problem with banks, when they bank those kind of companies, well, as soon as that goes in, the feds come after the bank, the feds come after the payroll company, the feds come after their creditors, the feds come after everything. So the banks are like, I don't really want to deal with that,
Right.
But like the majority of the companies we work with on the CBD side are trying to get CBD into a shampoo, trying to get CBD into a lotion, trying to get CBD into some kind of topical treatment.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely, again, a totally separate webinar, but cosmetics, and I don't actually know how like a shampoo would be classified by the FDA, if at all. But yes, the main concern is obviously the ingestible. So if you're interested in some sort of hemp-derived CBD company, the lotions, the shampoos, the cosmetics are going to be a somewhat safer bet. However, there are still a myriad of concerns that one must undertake. It is not a good idea to simply make it in your kitchen and then throw it up on Amazon for interstate commerce and sale. Different states have different packaging and labeling requirements, so on and so forth.
Right. And there's, I mean, the other thing that that's interesting about it is that, in terms of financing, banks, one of the other things is that, like Kim was discussing, the distinction between hemp and cannabis as defined, or marijuana as defined under Controlled Substances Act, is the concentration of THC. It has to be under 0.3% by dry weight. The problem is that if you're a grower and you're going to a bank for a loan, or you're a cultivator, if you go over, you're being closely monitored by a Department of Agriculture, whether it's the State Department of Agriculture that's received the permission for a pilot program under the 2018 Farm Bill from the federal government, or whether it's the Federal Department of Agriculture. Somebody is watching over your shoulder. And if your crop goes over that 0.3% threshold, you're obligated to destroy the entire crop, and there's no recourse. So from a bank perspective, not only do they want to not deal with the headache of monitoring, there's also a tremendous amount of risk. If you're the one loaning money to something and that they end up defaulting on a loan, then they're not going to be able to pay it back because their entire biomass is going to have to be destroyed. And I've asked Shauna about this and some other people in the insurance industry. Is right now that's not a risk that the insurance industry is prepared to insure against.
Correct. Grower misappropriation, grower errors, those aren't things that are going to be covered. They're not covered in any policy, actually, not just marijuana. If you have a, farm and ag policy, they're not going to be covered. And governmental actions are never covered. So
Right.
You got two places where, you got to be legal, you got to be in compliance. And as far as working from your home, like what Kimberly was talking about, don't mix up in your kitchen, slap a label on it, put on Amazon, and think you're going to be fine. You can't find coverage either. So if you do have somebody get sick from the product that you ingested, or because this keeps happening, you're putting something on your label that shouldn't be there, like this is 250 milligrams, and then someone, usually a class action attorney, is going to find that you put 100 milligrams in there and didn't test it. I know in the legal world, especially people that have worked with food class actions and natural substances, they know about the FDA guidelines for some of the other things. Like you need to test 6 times in 6 different batches. I don't know if this sounds familiar to you guys, but that's kind of the guidelines that's the guys that they go by. I encourage people that are in the manufacturing process, especially in hemp. You guys are being targeted right now. Class action attorneys are targeting you guys. So test your product in separate batches on separate days and document, and make sure so that if you do have to go to court, once, the government figures out, like, are we going to unfreeze these cases or not, you at least have some documentation to say, hey, I did my due diligence. I tested this before, I tested it after, I tested it at this degree, blah, blah, blah. And here you go. And you've shown that you've done the work to keep yourself and your business safe. And that's going through things like your user agreements online, hiring an attorney to go through your website is absolutely incredibly necessary so that you don't accidentally put some weird claim up there you didn't even remember putting up there. You have an attorney go through it page by page by page, go through your user agreements page by page, you know, look through all these things, make sure you're in the right circuit. Kind of important, right? So, you know, I think it's called a venue clause. So, and we talk about, we cover this on a surface when we're working with our clients of like, you need to speak to this professional for these reasons. You have to have these safety precautions in your facility for these reasons, because you cannot expect for insurance to pay for everything. And in this case, if you get raided, you're out of luck.
Yeah,
You know, you
absolutely.
have to self-protect. It's just like the biggest thing I can tell my clients and my peers, please self-protect. Don't expect all these services that you're paying for to cover you in all things. It's got to be a dual thing. You've got to do all of it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've run long, I think, but I appreciate everyone sticking around in the audience, and I also appreciate the time of all of our panelists today. I think this was a really fruitful, great discussion about the industry in general and also the effects of COVID, and we've really kind of been all over the map, but I think it's been a really great discussion. So again, this has been recorded, so we'll place this on our website. I can also send you a recording if you reach out to any one of us directly. We'll make sure to get it to you. But thank you to everybody for showing up today and joining us for this lunch panel discussion about the cannabis industry. I think, you know, we've any number of these topics could be subjects of their own webinar, and they probably will be in the future. I think, you know, at the very end, I was like, clearly we need our own hemp webinar if we're going this far into it. And I'd love to do that in the future. But I just want to say thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. This has been really fun for me, and I hope it's been fun for you guys. And feel free to reach out to any of us with any questions. I think our emails were all available in the newsletter that went out. So, and if you need someone's contact information, feel free to reach out to me. My email is ja@socal.law. You can find me on the Gupta Evans website. And with that, I want to say thank you and have a great rest of the afternoon to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jacob.
All right, thank you guys.